Good morning and welcome to our distinguished speakers, live streamers and viewers on YouTube to this webinar organized in cooperation with our sister think tank, SIEPS, the Swedish Institute of European Policy Studies, on the eve of the first grim anniversary of the launch of Russia's full-blown war against Ukraine. I'm Stephen Blockmans, Director of Research at SEPS, and I will be your host today. 1 year since Russia rolled its tanks across international borders and the contact lines established in 2014, it has laid waste to Mariupol, large parts of Kharkiv, as many other civilian areas and critical infrastructures around the country, indiscriminately killing thousands of Ukrainians, forcing millions from their homes and deporting thousands, including children, to Russia. The war has ended the post-Cold War European security order and created new realities and exceptional challenges in other countries neighboring the EU. But it has also led to an unexpectedly unified EU response and altered the discussions on the future of Europe, bringing to the fore issues related to both widening and deepening. The war has, in fact, shattered old illusions in Berlin, Paris, and other mainly Western European capitals about Russia's true intentions in the so-called shared neighborhood. And it has underlined how much of a security threat the Kremlin's imperialist tendencies pose for democracy in wider Europe. And with its decision to grant candidate status to Ukraine, as indeed Moldova, the European perspective to Georgia, the EU has rejected the idea of a Russian sphere of influence and instead has determined where its future borders should lie. But this decision has so far not led to a comprehensive strategy tailored to respond to the new geopolitical context. In the coming weeks and months, of course, humanitarian, military, and financial support will continue to be urgently needed, as will longer-term efforts to rebuild Ukraine and integrate it into the European Union. The Swedish presidency has vowed to promote a continued active and united EU response to counteract Russia's aggression and to support Ukraine. But what are the challenges and obstacles on the way? To help us better understand how to think and plan ahead for Ukraine and the European Union, we found three exceptional speakers able and willing to share with us their insights and analysis on the many issues at play. Hanna Shelest directs the security programs of the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism based in Odessa. Lars Danielsson is ambassador and permanent representative of Sweden to the European Union. And Katarina Engberg is senior advisor at SIEPS and previously, among many other things, Minister of Defense, working at the permanent representation of Sweden to the EU and also NATO. Hanna, allow me to start with you by asking how you would characterize the war and the challenges ahead.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for organizing this debate. And, you know, it's quite interesting for me to make the parallels after our last week trip to Sweden, where we had the pleasure of talking with different members of parliament, experts, community, ministries, and then to compare it with some other countries and their speeches and discussions within the last few days. It's always very important to remain sober. And that's probably one of the main conclusions after this year of war. Because originally, when the Russian invasion started, Ukraine really expected that everything is so clear. That is the first war in 70 years when it is clear, understandable who is victim, who is the aggressor, what is happening. But the reality became much more difficult. We still had countries and politicians, even within the European Union, who doubted or who tried to explain Russian position. And it sounded quite strange to try to explain the position of the rapist against the victim. However, we heard it not only from the extremely pro-Russian politician, but also from the moderate. Then definitely, when you speak about the unified position, we can say that it is more of the snowball, because more and more countries started to join the camp of those who originally clearly took the side of Ukraine and took the side of peace. You know, that was really interesting yesterday at the United Nations General Assembly to hear how many European politicians said, it's not about choosing the side of X or Y, good or evil. It is just choosing a proper side of the peace for what the United Nations being created. So definitely from original Baltics, Nordic and Poland, we started to have more and more countries. Spain, just yesterday, the Minister of Foreign Affairs visited Ukraine. But why I started from this idea that the main lesson we learned is to remain sober, not to be naive, and to understand that each day we need to fight even for the attention and for the position of the closest partners. Hungary, let's be honest, we are here, like, I'm not a politician, not a diplomat, I have a right to name. And you heard the statements of Mr. Orban, of his team within the last days. Honestly, like what the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Slovakia posted in his Facebook about the position of some Hungarian politicians, that's how the whole Ukrainian nation feels. Even that we understand that it is not position of the whole country. But can we speak about the unified position of the European Union when we have one of the member states who is blocking some decisions about sanctions, about the providing aid to Ukraine, and then just making statements that are very pro-Russian. So that's why we really would like to think that it is unified, but definitely not. Not speaking about the global South, and here we know perfectly the position of India, of China, and we should not even go to the countries like Iran or some others. Let's take the biggest democracy, India, that's definitely not taking Ukrainian position in this war of aggression. But still, as it is just the introduction, it seems to me that 1 year of Russian aggression also demonstrated that the choice for European integration that Ukraine decided, it's not just a political euphoria. It is the logical continuation, and for us, it is also the battle and the front. Because in 2014, people came to Maidan, even that we called it Euromaidan, for the European integration, not as the institution, but as the desire to be part of those values and principles. This war demonstrated that Ukrainian nation is ready to fight to defend these principles of freedom, of human rights, of democracy. And that is the choice, which is really, I don't like this word of civilizational choice that was so popular in 1990s. No, but that is definitely the choice between the autocracy, between the paranoia of the Russian leadership, and the choice of those values that Ukrainian people share. And connected to this, it seems to me the next lesson that many people in European Union finally learned that these principles, these values is something that we still need to defend and protect. Because let's be honest, people in European Union being quite relaxed. That's something that we used to have like an axioma, something normal, like, do we really need to explain it? Do we really need to fight? And you went to more deeper explanations of some of these ideas. But the reality demonstrated that there are still enough countries that are ready to challenge it and to challenge it with the war. And the fact that we are back to the, I don't know, beginning of the 20th century, probably, or at least the mid of the 20th century, when we still need to defend and to value what we have in our countries. That's why my conclusion for the introduction will be that if you follow all the statements from Moscow, you would understand that they consider European Union member states as party to the war. It was clearly understandable from the yesterday statement of the Russian representative to the UN. It was clearly understandable from the statement of Mr. Putin that he had also yesterday. And in all other statements, you can find the same. So as soon as Russia see European Union and European Union member states as enemy, that's quite strange, that still the European Union member states, some of them at least, do not feel themselves as side to the conflict and behave as they're just supporting Ukraine and somewhere outside, or believing that they can stay outside. Because if this position would continue, many of these countries can appear completely unprepared to any provocations from the Moscow side.
Thank you very much, Hannah. You're punching holes, of course, in the notion of a unified position of the EU, primarily. Ambassador, thank you for taking the time for your busy schedule. We understand that there's still quite a bit of work ahead to get the 10th sanctions package against Russia across the finish line, and that you may have to leave before the end of this webinar. Hannah pointed to the not so unified position of the EU, but what to you are the main challenges and obstacles that have been created by Russia's aggression against Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I think it is extremely, what has happened during the last year inside the European Union is, of course, that we all who are involved in this, institutions, member states, realize that we are in a completely new geopolitical situation. The European Union was previously regarded always as a payer, but not as a player. I think we have now realized that regardless of what we think, the European Union's geopolitical role has increased and must increase. But it should do it together with our like-minded partners in a way which I think so far has been quite impressive if I look at the actions that we have been able to produce so far. First of all, of course, we should say, I mean, particularly the day before the tragic first anniversary of the Russian aggression, that every tribute should go to the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government, for the heroic defense of not only your country, but also for your values and our values, which is something which has also helped, I think, to muster at least some degree of unity. I can agree with Hannah that we have sometimes a problem of unity of positions, but so far we managed to overcome that and produce the unity of actions. And this is what counts. I mean, if I look at what we have done over the past 12 months, it is much more than I would have expected. And that is, of course, because there is a growing realization among the political leaders, also among citizens, that this is I agree, it's not a fight between civilizations, but it's a fight between basically what is good in the world and what is bad in the world. That is, I think, exactly right. We have been able to produce substantial financial support for Ukraine. We have been able to produce humanitarian assistance of various sorts, and that also includes housing a very large number of Ukrainians who have chosen to temporarily leave their country and take home in some of the European countries. We have been able to muster military support in a way which I did not think was possible at all. I mean, even countries who have had previous difficulties in providing military assistance to other countries outside military alliances have been able to do that. And I think that is also something remarkable. We have been able to take these restrictive measures, the so-called sanctions. And yes, it's not always easy, but in the end, we have always so far managed to produce these rather, I think, these packages of restrictive measures, which I'm sure will have a growing influence on the Russian economy, and then also subsequently reduce the power of the Russian war machine. So I think what we have tried to do, and what we now try to do as presidency, is to little bit try to look away from the fact that yes, there are different views in some member states on what should be done, but we focus on what we can do. And then when I look at what we've done, I think so far we've been able to produce things which I think we should be reasonably proud of. We need to do more, and there is a clear commitment from everyone that we need to continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes, be it militarily, be it humanitarian, be it economically, and we will continue to do that. Now, the most important issue from now on, I think, is yes, of course, we will continue with the support, but we also need to produce more of unity when it comes to how can Ukraine get closer to the European structures and the European institutions, because that is the next issue that is on the agenda. When President Zelensky was here in Brussels about 2 weeks ago, he spoke very clearly and very realistically about the need to have a gradual process. He said very clearly, which I think is very admirable, Ukraine wants no shortcuts. We want to fulfill all the criteria, but we believe we can do that. I think that's exactly a word in exactly the kind of message that is so important, because there is a general hesitation among some member states that, look, can we manage such a large future member as Ukraine, given the difficulties we already have now with 27 member states? And I think we can actually, but it requires work, it requires change. It requires change in Ukraine, but it also requires change inside the European Union. And that is, I think, very, very, it's important that there is a realism on both sides, because I'm quite sure that this transformation of the European Union into more of a geopolitical actor will continue. It will hopefully include Ukraine as soon as possible, but it will also eventually include the Western Balkans. It will include Moldova. Maybe someday it'll even include Norway and Switzerland. How would I don't know. But I mean, I think we will see this transition continuing, and that is an extremely important process. Now, what I would like to say is that we have a very clear picture of the Ukrainian ambitions. Ukraine's government has been very clear in articulating the wishes, and I think that's very important. What we are now working with is how can we get a more of a joint position on the ambitions of the European Union. Now, if I summarize those now, because that has importance, I think, for the geopolitical context, I think one very clear position among most member states is that even though we have strong solidarity with Ukraine, we should, as far as future membership, candidate status, membership is concerned for Ukraine, we have to follow the normal procedure. This is also, I think, exactly in line with what the Ukrainian government expects, but I think it's also absolutely necessary to remember that all the time, that we need to follow the normal procedures, because otherwise we will not get what is absolutely necessary in the end, and that is popular support among member states for an enlarged union. We know that any enlargement in some member states require referenda. And that is why it's so important to show everyone that, yes, Ukraine merits membership in the European Union. That also may mean that it may take some time, but the important thing in my mind, not least from a geopolitical point of view, is that you can see that there is steady progress. The progress depends to a very large extent on what Ukraine is doing itself when it comes to reforms, and a lot of things are going on, and amazingly amount of things are going on, even though we are talking about a country at war. But we also need, and that's the more difficult issue, we also need to look probably at a somewhat different European Union than we have today. Because and that is not, I don't think that is so much a question of that we need to change the treaty, because we don't. We can very well enlarge the European Union within the present treaty up to 35 members. That's not the issue. The issue is about policies. How does a common agricultural policy look like with Ukraine as member? How does a cohesion policy look like with also Ukraine as member? Is there a possibility to increase the budget so we can afford the kind of policy that we have right now? Probably not, but we need to discuss that, and we need to start that discussion now, because unfortunately, most of the discussion about the future of union has been about the treaty. That's, in my mind, it's an issue. Yes, we may need to improve our decision-making capacity, but the main issue is about policies. It's about money. And I would hope that we can start during the Swedish presidency the sort of a more intense discussion on these issues. How do we change these policies? I see that the previous discussion we had about the role of a EU vis-a-vis the role of NATO is becoming less and less toxic. That's less of a problem now, partly because we now have more and more of a, so to say, unified composition of members in NATO and EU. At least if Sweden and Finland manages to get approval of all present NATO members to become members. But so that is less of an issue. I think we have a rather clear, let's call it division of labor, which I think is very helpful. But the policies, for the rest of the policies, we have a problem, and we need to work with that. And we need to work in that, in my mind, in such a way that when the European Union decides on its next long-term budget, which will be from 2028, we need to have these issues in mind. And that means that the discussion has to start now. There is more to say, but I think I'll stop there for the time being and give the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A range of issues indeed to unpack in the ensuing discussion. But before we go there, Katarina Engberg, I'm sure you have comments on what you've heard so far.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. And first, I want to salute the brave Ukrainian people, 1 year into its heroic resistance against Russian imperialism. This is your struggle, it's our struggle. And I think there's a realization throughout Europe that this will not be solved within the next couple of years. We are likely to live on a war footing for a foreseeable future, and I may come back to elaborate on that point. First, regarding sanctions, since the ambassador mentioned the 10th sanctions package. We now seem to be looking at a broader sort of sanctions regime. The EU has appointed a new sanctions envoy, O'Sullivan, and the EU, the UK and the US are discussing how to address the fact that lots of valuable resources are seeping in to Russia through third countries. Countries mentioned are Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, etc. How to address the fact that valuable components for the Russian war machine are still seeping through. How shall we view this sort of enlarged sanctions regime? And what if, as the American Secretary of State Blinken has warned, China goes ahead and actually provides Russia with lethal military aid, which I think is still, we haven't seen yet, but still the Americans have raised the issues. Should we be prepared then for secondary sanctions against China with all the repercussions for global trade, not least for the relationship between the European Union and China intertwined in terms of economies and trade? We have to think about sort of beyond the successive sanction package for Russia and think ahead. Another point, how shall we pay for the war? The High Representative Borrell has highlighted the fact that the EU countries will spend 70 billion euros more on defense over the next 2 years. However, how do we spend it wisely? We have for Ukraine and for ourselves. We have already spent 12 billion jointly, member states, and through the European Peace Facility in support for Ukraine. And in spite of all the hesitations initially, I think the Europeans have come around to a very solid position on this matter, and I'm very pleased to see that. But how shall we pay for this in the long run? And that ties into the ambassador point about thinking about the long-term budget and the components of the long-term budget in order to help us continue the aid to Ukraine, but also secure that the new money coming into defense for our own countries is well spent through maybe joint procurement, standardized systems, etc. We had to think anew. One thing is paying in the immediate run for Ukraine's ammunition, and we have the Estonian Prime Minister Kallas proposal for 4 billion euros for artillery shells for Ukraine, and the idea would be that the Commission would do a joint procurement. Well, that is this issue that will be discussed in the next couple of weeks, and I'm not going to delve into this. Just to mention that there are so many issues for us Europeans to think about in the perspective that we will live on a war footing for the foreseeable future. The world around us, the High Representative Borrell, in his speech to the General Assembly, said that this is not Europe's war. This is the war of all of us who support a rules-based world system. The fact is, however, we are moving into a multipolar global system in which positions of part of the global south, as we have talked about, is not secured. Some of them because they feel that this is the Western fault, the Americans' fault, or it doesn't concern us, or because it offers opportunity to negotiate politically between Russians, Chinese, and Europeans in various manners. However, this is a serious issue to address for the Europeans. And I noted that the German Chancellor Scholz in München said, we cannot only appeal to the global South on the basis of values. One would hope that would be enough. But to be realistic, we also had to address the interests of the global South, to have them listen to us. And I also noticed President Macron's proposal for a conference in June in Paris, in which one would discuss the governing bodies of the World Bank, the IMF, but also the UN Security Council. That is to amend the governance bodies of these institutions, many of which were created after the Second World War and reflect Western positions at the time, not only, but to a large extent. That's another huge issue. But on the larger issue, on the sort of world we live in, the future we face, I think we have to be brief, and we can elaborate on this, that we shall envisage a gradual integration of Ukraine into the European Union, as the ambassador was sort of alluding to. You're already linked up to our electricity grid, as is Moldova, by the way. Von der Leyen has said that Ukraine will get a seamless access to the single market. How will that happen? However, it will not happen as in the past with sequential integration that spans over decades. This will happen in a different manner through a functional integration. And if we then look at the possible outcome of the war, which may not be a clear-cut solution or any peace agreement, because I think the Russians have many reasons for wanting to retain, of course, as much possible territory of Ukraine as they can. I hope they won't be able, but they would be interested in just letting it lie as a frozen conflict. And then if Ukraine will not get security guarantees from NATO, but a patchwork of security guarantees from different countries, that will then pose the European Union in the situation where it will share the border with Russia, with the Russian Empire and a frozen conflict. That's not a new fine security architecture. Let us rather think about this possible very messy outcome of the situation. Still, it's worth to pay the price if that is the outcome, because that means that we will be on the road to draining Eastern Europe of the conflict sources that have been so painful for the peoples living between Germany and Russia in this case. The Western side has been solved with the outcome of the Second World War and the creation of the called Osto Union and then European Union between France and Germany. Now we have to drain Eastern Europe of its conflict potential, and thus we have to welcome Ukraine into the family. But let's be realistic about the future prospects for the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I see that some of the members of our online audience have already found their way to the Q&A box in Zoom. Please go there indeed to pose a question. Ambassador, there's the first question which is addressed to you. Not sure if you had a chance to read it, but let me, for the sake of a better understanding, do so. When you talk about the common position, the EU position on the aims and ambition in regards to Ukraine's accession to the EU, the question is how this common aim sits vis-a-vis to what victory might look like in the conflict. And with various member states hedging their bets or maybe being fearful of taking a position as of yet, the question is how the Swedish presidency is trying to converge on the finalité, if you want, of both the conflict and match that with the ongoing accession process.
Well, I'm always very hesitant to spend too much discussing the finalité, because we're so far away from that situation right now. I believe that Katarina is right in saying that we probably have to be prepared for a rather long period of some sort of conflict, weaponized conflict, and I think our focus should be a bit more short term. But at the same time, of course, we need to keep the longer perspective in mind. The biggest mistake we can do, and I think will also create, is to try to put timetables on things. It's not realistic to say, for example, that Ukraine should be member of the European Union at that and that year, because that will sort of create more problems than it will solve. We have two processes which are necessary. One is what's happening in Ukraine on the ground, first of all, but then eventually also when it comes to reforms. The other one is how quick can we be about the changes that are necessary inside the European Union. So I think what our role is as president, what our role as president member states is that we need to focus the discussion on these issues. We need to be more transparent, more clear about the fact that the European Union, which basically started as some sort of internal market and an economic entity, is now changing its nature quite dramatically. That change is going quite quick, but we need to discuss that. We need to have an interaction with our own citizens on that issue, and then eventually that will lead, I'm quite sure, to a future Europe, which will be a future European Union, which is larger than we have today, but maybe also a little bit different in nature. That remains very much about depends on the what is happening on the ground. I think we will be more and more a union of values, a union of member states that adheres to certain principles. But we also need to take into account a fact which we see very clearly, and that is that any transformation of a country from an authoritarian system to a more democratic system is a transition process that takes longer than most people think. I mean, we had the notion. I was very much involved in a previous capacity in the large enlargement of the European Union, which resulted in 10 member states, 10 new countries coming in 2004. And many of us thought, okay, as long as these member states come into the union, then everything will fix itself and there is no problem. Well, we've seen since then that there is a problem, and we need to deal with that. So I think the best thing we can do is to be pragmatic, meticulous, careful, open, and transparent, and be very clear about what is the European Union basically about. Well, it is about values, principles, democracy, an open market, and things like that. And we have this as a background, and then we're now taking step by step in the direction that is necessary. How quick that will be, I don't know, and it's not the most important thing right now. But the issue is, and that's my final point on this, is that at the same time as we do this, we also need to look at the rest of the world. And the big issue here, which Katarina also mentioned, is, in my mind, where will China go on this issue? We know where Russia has going already. They have gone in the wrong direction, to say the least. But China, I mean, my background is China studies, basically, from the beginning. And I must say, I am extremely surprised that China seems to be on its way now to do things which they shouldn't do when it comes to cooperation with Russia, because that is against the basic Chinese thinking on so many issues. I hope I'm right and that Secretary Blinken and others are wrong, but I'm not sure any longer. But this is the key geopolitical issue for the European Union, is where will China go? Because that is so decisive for the future. Sorry to be a bit long, but it's an interesting issue.
No, that's absolutely fine. In fact, a couple of things that immediately brought up here, which are worth exploring a little bit further. First, still in connection to your remark about no timetables, is there nevertheless a feeling that the European hands is being forced in taking decisions out of geopolitical interest without itself being prepared? And the question which is posed in the Q&A box is whether both the moral authority that and the Zelensky effect that is being created over the past year might even be interpreted by some member state capitals as a sort of blackmail in trying to fast track the Ukrainian membership application. Do you share that feeling or that concern?
No, I don't see any sort of blackmail here. I think there's one issue which is quite clear. It's always easy to see things in hindsight, But the European reaction, or for that matter, the global reaction to what happened in 2014 was way too weak, way too lame. I mean, we grossly underestimated the sort of Russian intentions with the annexation of Crimea and the eastern part, the eastern part of Ukraine, and that has been, so to say, with us. I think since then, I think what we're now seeing is, I think, a genuine belief in virtually, maybe not everybody, but virtually every capital, every member state, is that, look, we should not do the same mistake as we did in 2014. Things are crucial now. We're fighting to some extent at least, for the survival of the kind of societies that we all have come to cherish, so I don't think there is anyone feeling blackmailed or forced, because this is not what it's all about. I think it's very clear. You will hear that, for example, tomorrow again, when the EU 27 leaders will pronounce themselves at the anniversary of the Russian aggression, that there is a very clear commitment to the notion, which is the most topical right now, that is, Ukraine's place is in Europe and in the European Union. There's no doubt about it. What there is a discussion about are these other issues. How quick, what is required, what do we need to do? And that's fine, that's perfectly normal. We should have those discussions, but there is no hesitation about the sort of end goal for this process. And that doesn't only apply to Ukraine, it applies to Moldova, it applies to the Western Balkans, it applies hopefully also someday to Georgia, even though we have problems there right now, as we all know. So maybe I've lived in the Brussels bubble now for almost 7 years now, and of course I know the discussions may be a bit more skeptical in some capitals, but my job is to try to guide my colleagues, the other 26 ambassadors, in a daily work to try to ensure that we do everything we can to support Ukraine and to stop the aggression. And in that endeavor, yes, it takes a bit longer sometimes than I would hope to. 10th sanctions package is such an example, but we're getting there. So far, we're getting there virtually every time. And that gives me hope, at least.
Thank you very much. Hannah, I'm keen to bring you back into the conversation as well. You may want to react to some of the points which are already mentioned, the role of China, for example, but also how you see the future EU position vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, they're hard to be disentangled right now, of course, the EU's Ukraine policy and a future strategy how to deal with Russia. So feel free to pick up some of these points.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try to, because there were several things that I wanted to comment, and they will be a little bit like a bullet points considering our time, but still. First, about China. For Ukraine, we feel it as China is trying to be pragmatic. And definitely their conflict with the US is overshadowing their position towards Ukraine. But at the same time, territorial integrity is one of the axioms for the Chinese foreign policy. So they definitely have the internal conflict in their thinking how to act. As for now, Ukraine at least tried to be with the position that neutral China, that is the best way for us. So we understand their concerns. We don't want to push, but we want them not to support the Russian Federation, especially in terms of military, because that's what can change the situation on the ground when Russia is lacking the ammunition, especially. That's why if China is pragmatic, and looks like China definitely looks to its economic cooperation with the European Union and the possible sanctions from the European Union, either direct or the second-hand sanctions, as important factor for the decision-making of their policy towards Russia, we hope that that will work. When we speak about the understanding that in 2014 mistakes were made, and now many politicians came to the idea that they don't want the repetition, honestly, I'm not so optimistic as the ambassador, because speaking in different MFAs around Europe with different politicians, I heard it quite often that they don't feel that Minsk agreements and that those appeasements of Russia in 2014 was a mistake. And let's start from the big person, Angela Merkel, who said, and in terms about these, that no mistakes were made in 2014 from her, and she still thinks that that is the best way. So only when really everybody would understand what huge mistakes were made, not only in 2014, but also in 2008 with Georgia, probably we would have a different policy towards the Russian Federation. Then frozen conflict. That is the worst scenario for Ukraine. If you would propose me different variations of different options, frozen conflict is the worst. And frozen conflict is exactly what the Russian Federation would like to have. First of all, because they have example of Moldova and Transnistria. It is 30 years of the frozen conflict. What are the results? Do you know what was the main statement of the Russian Ministry of Defense this morning at 5 o'clock in the morning? That Ukraine is going to attack Transnistria, that we already brought our forces, and that some provocations will be there. So even after 30 years, even after all rounds of negotiations, Russia is now trying to instigate to fire the situation in Transnistria. And it is the still variant how to jeopardize national security of Moldova, and no ways for the peaceful settlement. Because especially when you have years without fighting, you're starting to discuss more talks about talks, where we meet, which of the capitals, who should be in the delegation, but you're not discussing the substance. And what Donbass demonstrated, that these 9 years allowed Russia to re-educate people, to use their propaganda, to delete them from the Ukrainian discourse, to prohibit them speaking Ukrainian, and all other stuff. So they're changing identity of people, and that is the example just for the school books. That's why we should not aim to freeze the conflict as the possible temporary solution. That is not. That unfortunately is just bringing additional problems. We need to think how to stop this fighting and how not to return back to pre-February 2022 situation. And the last but not the least, because that is connected, Katerina said about how to spend money, about financing, and we know that this question is extremely important for most of our European partners. Trust me, it is not less important for Ukraine, because we understand that resources are not unlimited. And the longer war is going, the more resources we need. But here, usually, our argument is, we understand that we have one basket of finance, let's say finance or resources. The more you need to spend for armed forces right now, not in the long-term perspective, the quicker you give us these resources now to fight against Russia, the less you will need to spend for recovery and reconstruction of our critical infrastructure, residential and areas and all others. Why? Because what Russia is doing, they are destroying our business, our way of life, our critical infrastructure. So that's why it is really, when we speak about spending wise, long term is important, but the future of the war and the future of the peace will depend how quickly Ukraine receives the ammunition now. And that's really what can change the situation on the ground. That's why in Ukraine, we're really looking for this decision about the joint purchase of the ammunition. As for me, that is the extreme breakthrough as for the European Union, such decision. It was once made for vaccines. It is now discussed for the ammunition. That will be huge for the market and for the future of Ukraine and for the future of the European defense industry. And it seems to me that will also have a positive effect inside of the European Union, because we already, through this aggression, triggered a lot of important questions for the European common defense policy that's been stuck for the last years, let's be honest. We started to speak about military Schengen. We started to speak about military logistics in the better way. We made the audit of the resources of the defense industry. We started finally to speak about PESCO in the different way, because PESCO remained very closed for the European Union member states, even that legally it was possible to join. And now we speak more about United Kingdom, about Ukraine, about other producers of weapons, how to unite our efforts, how to be more effective, what should be the priorities. So that's why that is very important. But also the last but not the least, we always speak about the member states financing and budget. We are extremely grateful for all this money, because we understand that this money are coming from what could be spent for their own citizens. But if we have decisions, who is aggressor? If we have decisions of the international organizations about this, and if we have decisions about frozen Russian assets, we finally need to make at the European Union level proper decision about how to take this money and to spend it for the reconstruction, not just to fill the budget, but why not to take the money of the Russian Central Bank to reconstruct the power station near Odessa or in Mykolaiv, the water station that's been destroyed. So that's really like you have the financing, but you need finally to make decisions and to find the variants how to spend this money.
Thanks, Anna. I'm sure Ambassador Danielsson will come back to some of these points, but first I wanted to pick up on Katarina Engberg's notion, which is also resonating in the chat box by Ambassador Moran, who's equally surprised about the Chinese direction of travel, and argues that the EU would be well off in firing a shot across their bows by starting formal discussions in Brussels about sanctions. I suppose he's talking about sanctions on China, whereas I think, Katarina, you alluded more to the possibility of the impact on the EU of US secondary sanctions being imposed on China, but both are, of course, tracks on which the EU should think further. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on the thought you had there before I turn it back to Ambassador Danielsson?
This is still hazy. We don't know. First, let's see what the Chinese do, because if they move ahead with lethal military aid to Russia, that will have serious repercussions or can have serious repercussions for global trade. So one would hope that Chinese, now trying to come out of the COVID restrictions and firing up their economy again, they would be reluctant to put the wealth of their nation at risk. So let's hope they will not do it. But if they do it, I think there will be sanctions. There will be sanctions on the part of the European Union, on the part of the US. And there may be secondary sanctions also the countries that are delivering through neighboring countries to Russia valuable components for the defense industry, things that have been embargoed through these different decisions by the European Union, the United States and the UK, one should add. So let's see, but maybe the ambassador has a clearer view of what might happen. It's very intriguing to understand where the Chinese are moving. They have, of course, as they believe it, a common cause with Russia in that they want to speed up the changing global relationships in a way that is less Western than they used to be. We are relatively, will be a smaller part of the global society over time, but they sort of, almost in a revisionist manner, want to speed up that change. And then, of course, try to muster the support of the global South, where many, rightly in some ways, think that the systems with regard, for example, governance of different international institutions should be changed that in order to better reflect the world that is growing and not the past. So, but we have a concerning fact that, and of course, they have this common interest, but then, of course, the Chinese would equate Taiwan with Ukraine, as both the Americans and NATO is also doing. This is not a different global theaters, but this is a global security. And what's the way the West is approaching the conflict in Ukraine is also signaling to China what would happen if they moved ahead with regard to Taiwan. So they have common understanding in those areas, but then their trade dependence, their professed interest in raising the level of standards of the Chinese people. How do the Chinese reconcile these different goals? What is concerning is that both China and Russia have, over the last years, and one would say decade, moved towards more autocratic societies, as if that was required for the leadership of those countries to retain the grip of their societies, which in a way showed that sort of shows there's an underlying weakness, a problem in terms of governance of those countries. Now, Russia has moved even further from autocracy to what we would always call an authoritarian and maybe even worse state. But that is a concern. That's something that should concern us, that we don't know sort of what the political instincts of those sorts of leaderships.
Thank you, Katarina. To me, it seems that discussions on imposing sanctions on China would be fraught with many difficulties among member states, especially given trade relations, of course, with the country, the European Union as a whole being much more vulnerable in terms of trade volumes than the more inward-looking single markets of the US and China. So I don't think the EU would travel very fast in that direction, but it would be good to know from the ambassador whether he's at liberty to say whether exploratory talks on these issues are happening among member states.
No, I think the clear answer to that question is no. And I think it would be a mistake at this point to discuss it. I think we have much more important issues to discuss. I think it's an interesting sort of philosophical discussion, but I don't think don't see any signs at all to start to discuss them that way. My view on China in this conflict is exactly the same as Hanna's. I think you're exactly right. I mean, the notion of territorial integrity is a sanctity in the Chinese philosophy, and I honestly, I mean, we don't know exactly what's in the mind of the Chinese leadership, and with Xi Jinping, the unpredictability has increased. But I would say that a more likely outcome of the present, so to say, overtures that China seem to be having towards Russia would be some sort of so-called peace initiative, which probably would be a peace initiative on completely the wrong terms. Well, let's see what they come up with. But I'm more afraid of the sort of narrative of Chinese peace than the narrative of Chinese delivery of ammunition and things like that, because I think they will continue to be very careful. If you have time, and it helps if you understand Chinese, listen to the public part of the conversation between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin at this summit last fall somewhere in Central Asia. I don't remember exactly. If you listen close to what Xi Jinping says there, of course, it's a few months ago, so things may have changed, but that in my mind confirms that even this Chinese leadership still has the same view on territorial integrity as previous ones have had. And so therefore, I would focus on trying now to do everything we can to help A, Ukraine win the war, B, then try to ensure that we create a geopolitical Europe which can be a stronger part in tomorrow's global world, rather than, and that includes trying to be better at handling the relation with China, which is extremely complicated, and that needs at least 4 more CEPs and CEP seminars in order to straighten out. So I hope I'm right, and I even dare to say I think I'm right when it comes to China's role.
Can I ask you a question which, in fact, Katarina Engberg threw up in her opening remarks, which is in reference to the 12 billion euros in total channeled through the EPF as well as member states funding on defense support, lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. There's a discussion which seems to have started to bring all of this on budget, so as to be able to pay for longer term expenditures in this field, and perhaps also provide more democratic scrutiny over those defense spendings. There was a reference also to joint procurement in this respect, which we know is a field riddled with national exceptions. What are the discussions at the moment on EU defense industrial cooperation funding CSDP in a wider context? Where do you see the biggest movements in the next couple of weeks or months?
Well, the focus right now is to get how can we get more ammunition to Ukraine? That's the main issue right now. The problem is that the Commission cannot buy ammunition directly by itself for legal reasons. So we have to find other mechanisms, and that's one of the things which I have to deal with in about 6 minutes, is what is the best vehicle for that? I mean, is it to have one member state taking the lead and then trying to see if we can that way, so to say, have joint purchases? How much can we use the European Defence Agency? So we will manage that. We normally always do that. But I think it's a very difficult time and almost a dangerous time to try to get too bogged down in exactly how should we finance future defense spending, defense industry spending on the European level. That has always been a difficult discussion. The discussion has partly been difficult because there are different views on what is European defense industry. I mean, we have a very strong European defense industry in Sweden, but most of it is either wholly or partly owned by the US or the UK. Does that make it less of a European defense industry? Well, not in our mind, but there are some of our partners who think it makes it less. So it's a principal discussion. We don't have time for that right now. We need to ensure that as much delivery as possible is provided to Ukraine. We have the EPF for financing. We probably need more. Should it be in budget or outside budget? Well, I don't have a clear view. I mean, if you have more democratic scrutiny, that's great, but it also takes longer time. And there will be a review of our long-term budget starting this summer, but we don't have time to wait for that. It's a question of how can we provide money now? Or how can we, so I think this is what we're focusing on. This means, unfortunately, that I have to leave now because it's not only the 10th sanctions package, but it's our ammunition package, which I have to give priority to. I hope you understand that. It's always a pleasure to participate in this kind of seminars. I apologize for not being able to participate all the way through, but I hope you realize that sometimes you have to make your priorities, and that unfortunately means putting SEPs and CEPs a little bit further down the line at this time. So thank you very much for the invitation, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having taken the time to join us and sharing your views and candid insights with us. Good luck with the next steps.
Thank you.
Katarina, can I ask you to develop your ideas, which you pose maybe in a question, how to pay for arms support to Ukraine, or indeed joint procurement in the future, to bring it on budget? Are there other ways that you foresee?
Well, it seems, if I listen to the High Representative Borrell in München, he seemed to say that in order to finance the short-term deliveries to Ukraine, we shall use the peace facility. And that's member state-based, and there is still some money available. The problem is the long-term production capacity of our industries. I mean, not only are we taking substantial resources from our national defense, there is a lack of production capacity. I think the German Chancellor compared with the production of cars, that we have to put ourselves more in the mind of car producers. That is, defense industry used to procure one system and then you stopped. Because we didn't feel this need to have a long-term supply of huge systems and a lot of ammunition. Now that has to change. You have to put you have to procure constantly and assure the industry that long-term investments will be made in long-term production. Otherwise, the industry will just not. They will just make the immediate deliveries, but they will not produce for a long time. For that, they need financial assurances. And for those financial assurances, if I understood Kalla's proposal correctly and what has been said by others, you would use the EU budget and some sort of procurement by the Commission or a member state, leading member state, as the ambassador was alluding to, because that's much larger sums. I mean, the proposal by the Estonian Prime Minister Kallas is 4 billion euros. I mean, you can't take that out of the European peace facility unless member states suddenly want to add on a number of new billions. But that's where the discussion concerns the budget, because The EU budget, of course, has much larger resources, but those would be used then for, in comparison, in a parallel to the purchase of vaccine, that the Commission secure member states long-term investment in the industry so that they can start to invest for long-time production, because our production systems, not only are we depleted of our own resources, our production systems are running low. So it's both the short-term delivery, but also ensure the long-term delivery of these resources for ourselves and for Ukraine. And for the latter part, it seems that that is where the EU budget comes in. If I have understood it correctly, it will be discussed in, I think, 10 days in Stockholm, by the way, at the Defense Ministerial. So we'll see how the proposals evolve over time. And not only not all countries are happy of giving the Commission more to say in terms of procurement, my own country being one of them. So this is a complicated matter.
It sure is. We actually have a commentary by our CEO out today, which dabbles into these issues, and also the national security exception that exists still on a treaty basis. But Hanna, you refer to Ukraine, to PESCO, and to wider EU defense arrangements as they have been building up mainly on paper and gradually now through the different budget lines that are opened. Also in reality, the development of platforms, of course, is still a long way ahead. But there is a movement also from the Ukrainian side. I mean, the Ukrainian army is obviously the most battle-hardened of Europe at this moment for unfortunate reasons, but nevertheless a reality. And it has also triggered the activation of one of the first PESCO projects in terms of cyber defense. How would you see future cooperation between Ukraine and the European Union develop? There was a lot of talk both by Katarina Engberg as well as the ambassador about pathways towards gradual integration of candidate countries as a way to functionally accelerate their not just association, but in fact integration into EU policies. Might defense be such an avenue, or do you see obstacles there?
It's neither obstacle nor the avenue. And let's start from the PESCO and the Defense Cooperation, and then we can go to the grounded question that we also have within the Q&A about the statements of our Prime Minister regarding 2026, or in general premature or not discussions about Ukrainian integration. First, about PESCO. PESCO is not only about production. PESCO is also about joint command control or training or other stuff of the project. And Ukraine asked to join PESCO several years before the Russian aggression started in 2022. So we already had these discussions that we wanted. And here we had what to bring to the European table: our aviation industry, our engines for the missiles, our cybersecurity. All of these were already on the table and proposals. This year demonstrated that Ukraine is not only asking for the foreign ammunition, because definitely we don't have systems like HIMARS or Patriot. But if you look, for example, for the drones development, the drones development in Ukraine is now huge, and it is local production that is really interested. The Delta system for the command and control of the battlefield, the unique system that's been introduced for the NATO, and none of the European Union or NATO countries has anything similar to these. The cybersecurity experience you already have. There are plenty of other types of ammunition that I can name that really our own industry started to develop, and many of them we are talking with the particular European countries, either with the Sweden, who is producing a lot, and I know that these trips were done by our defense industry for the joint cooperation. I know that the same are happening with the United Kingdom, with France, all these negotiations, with Poland, and even some of our defense industry plants needed to move from Kharkiv, for example, to Poland. So that is happening. It's practically already. Now we just need to make it more systematic and more strategic, understanding the priorities and where is the best experience and best resources. But if you go to further, can it help? Yes, it can, because you understand that that is very, very sensitive sphere. So it can allow to build trust. It is the sphere that is usually needed a big integrity and accountability, because we are speaking about serious money and serious technologies. So that's also allow working with the different standards within this line and the political dialogue. But still, 2026 is probably too optimistic. But I understand why Ukrainian government sometimes is standing these days. It's not about, as one of our listeners said, that we would like to press European Union. No, that's also work very seriously inside of Ukraine, because Ukraine understands how many reforms we need to make. And as with the visa-free regime many years ago, only when Ukraine has very clear sets, marks, dates, deadlines, that's when we start really implementing these reforms. So that's why when the government is setting these dates for themselves, it means that it's not just pushing European Union member states, it's pushing your own agencies and institutions to adopt at least those legislation that we need. So we have time for testing it, for trying, and for adjusting. Is it premature discussions about the integration or not? It seems to me that it is not a relevant question anymore, because if the country became a candidate officially, how can it be premature or not premature? That means that we made this choice. European Union, as the institution, as a member states, made this choice. Now it is the question of practical work. So what does it mean premature or not premature? The decision is made. Now it is the process that we need to reach. And that is just the question how we are going there. Sometimes you can hear from the Ukrainian politicians that they are asking for a little bit, not the quicker decisions, but let's say the decisions of wartime, understanding that a lot of the procedures within the European Union were made for the peaceful time. And some of them just became traditions, but not a necessity. And if we can speak that, for example, we can open some chapter of the negotiations after Ukraine filled these 7 requirements that we received in June last year, there are already some spheres that we can negotiate even during the war. We should not wait the end of the war to open them, because it will allow us to be more resilient, more effective, more democratic, and that also will be important for Ukraine as the state and for the society, because that will give the benefits over here. We are not a failed state. And we know that there are certain restrictions in some of the European capitals for adopting. Should we open the negotiations while Ukraine is in the war or not? But let's be honest, judicial reform, for example, does it matter? Or some standards for the competition in the industry. That doesn't matter you are in the war or not. That's something about the development of the state that Ukraine is trying to continue doing. That's why we need to understand that limitations sometimes are with the absolutely different and obstacles are more in our decision-making process and some political manipulations that Russia used a lot in their propaganda, rather than the real fact and the pool of options that we have to move this process.
Thanks very much. I have a look at both at the clock, but also the questions that still have been posed in the chat box. Katarina, I suppose the question about Turkey's role is central to Swedish interests, and the point which is being made in the Q&A is how you interpret Turkey's role in this war, and with drone aids to Ukraine, economic relations with Russia, and Sweden's the veto on Sweden's NATO entry. How do you assess Turkey in all of this?
First, Turkey and Russia. These are two nations in different formations that have been close neighbors over the centuries. They have fought wars. They have cooperated with different mixes over time, and that's what we are seeing again. Turkey is trying to, in my mind, try to expand its influence, to see what are the boundaries for its regional influence. It is an old empire, so like many old empire, that's the way they think about their identity. And we have seen them being very proactive in the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, for example, where the Russians accepted their involvement to a certain degree. They have delivered some drones to Ukraine, but at the same time, a lot of valuable resources for the war is going through, as it seems. I have not, from what I read, a lot of resources are passing through the Turkish border to Russia. And I think that this is a mix in the Turkish position. And the Russians on their side, I think they give some leeway to Turkey in areas where they should have been more restrictive without the Ukraine war, because Russia can be, or Turkey can be a partner on other issues for Russia, and is creating problems in terms, for example, the accession of, in particular, Sweden to the European Union. So I think it's a mixed relationship. We have heard Turkish representatives state very clearly that, and I'm not talking about the official, but some of their, as it is at least said, close advisors, that Ukrainian territorial integrity cannot be questioned. That's it has to regain its territorial integrity. But there were other issues in Putin's proposal before the outbreak of the war that may be of interest to discuss. And these issues are, of course, the enlargement or more of a space for the non-Western state in the global system, as a point I was making in the beginning. So this is an area where I think the Turks may have some sympathy for Russian positions. With regard to Sweden, this also ties in, of course, to internal politics in Turkey, and in the lead up to the Turkish election, whenever it will be held. It has, of course, been useful to point to a Swedish position on Kurdish organizations, some of them dubbed terrorist, also by the European Union. We have a large Kurdish refugee community in Sweden, a result from sort of our refugee policy, previous refugee policy, and our current refugee policy. So that is a special case with Sweden, which of course is where the Turks resent Swedish position, but it's also useful internal. And I would say part of the American Congress have similar views on many of these issues. So this is also a way of sort of trying to influence American positions on the matter, on these matters. So there is now the sign of the Turkish representatives that the tripartite Turkish, Finnish, Swedish negotiations will, on the agreement signed by the three parties, will restart, and it's likely to happen within the next couple of weeks. What does that mean in terms of Turkish views on Swedish membership before Vilnius in NATO? We don't know, and we can't. We can only guess what Erdogan is thinking. I think it's very much up to himself.
Thank you very much, Hanna. I would like to address the last question in the chat box to you, which deals with Russia policy. Tomorrow is, of course, sad anniversary of Russia's not first, but certainly most devastating invasion of Ukraine in recent times. It is also a day on which an EU member state, Estonia, celebrates its independence from Russia in 1918. Looking in the crystal ball, not knowing exactly how this conflict may end, how would you nevertheless think about relations with Russia in the future? Is this one of coexistence, one of contention?
That's an interesting question, because we understand perfectly that Russia is our neighbor and it would not disappear. And I'm not one of those who are thinking that Russia will just dissolute into different parts and we will have, doesn't matter, 3 or 25 new republics, because still what is Moscow and Iran will be with Ukraine. Yep. So we don't care what China is going to do with the Far East, but here we still have Moscow. The problem is that we clearly understand that without changes inside of Russia, we would not have the different situation. For us, it is anti-colonial war. That's why our Baltic partners understand us so well. That is not what started in 2014. That is not what started in 1991. A lot of policies, a lot of statements that now you hear in the statements of Mr. Putin, they are back to the 19th century, 18th century, and many others. So that is for us, it is anti-colonial war and the war for the real independence. But with the current imperialistic leadership, and it's not Mr. Putin, because they really grown up, the whole generation of people who are thinking like this, imperialistic thinking about Russia itself and the relations with neighbors, because this year clearly demonstrated the same feelings against Kazakhstan, against Georgia, against Moldovans, and it is just amplifying. It is becoming worse and worse, unfortunately. We will not have the changes. But the problem is who would do these changes. And you know what, I really was shocked recently when I started reading Russian opposition representatives who are living abroad and who are insisting that Ukraine needs to enter territory of Russia and to change the regime in Moscow. And our reaction was like, why we need to care about you? And they really have the very strong accusation to our side that because Ukraine didn't support some protest in Russia, probably we needed to bring our population to do this or something like this and to overtake Putin in the Kremlin. That's why Ukrainians are guilty that Putin is still in Kremlin. And this, for me, quite an ill perception of that everybody is guilty and everybody owes something to the Russian opposition, but not them to create the real strong power against. And because their actions before this were not effective, but Ukraine is not going to enter the territory of the Russian Federation. That is sovereign state, and we are not intervening there. Moreover, we have a lot of stuff to do in our country. Why we should solve the issues of another country in this way? So that's why I don't know when these changes really happen. Because also as the symbol for us, why it is becoming more difficult. Okay, we understand you cannot take anti-war demonstration in Moscow. It is dangerous with all their regime. Why all those thousands of Russians who left Russia are not joining demonstrations in Berlin, in Tbilisi, in Paris, in London? Have you seen any demonstration? I saw how Iranians and Ukrainians united during the Halifax conference in November in Canada to have the joint even demonstration. I haven't seen any Russian demonstration in none of the countries anti-war. So that demonstrates that many of those people who left the country, they are not against the principles of this war or of its explanation. They just don't want to die. And with this, what is the future for Russia? I don't know, because I understand that without the change of their cautious mindset, whatever, we can make any plans. We can create any Russian-speaking media, what Ukraine been doing, but we still will have this understanding of others from the Russian citizens. That's why Ukraine is building its society and its security guarantees in ways of understanding that this threat is for long, even if the war is over. That's why Ukraine is aiming to be a member of NATO, because we understand the deterrence factor of this, not Article 5, but in general, the deterrence factor. That's why Finland and Sweden are joining. That's why we would like to be members of the European Union. That's why we would like to build very strong armed forces of Ukraine, because we understand that we need all possible way of domestic deterrence and external deterrence, not to allow Russia before its change, before its purification, to be the same threat as it is now.
Thank you, Hanna, for your views. This opens up, of course, many other issues that to which we could devote more talks and seminars. But we've exhausted our time allotted for this webinar. So I would like to thank you. I would like to thank, of course, Katarina Engberg, Ambassador Danielsson, who had to leave us a bit earlier, for your insights, your wisdom. I would like to thank the online audience for their active participation, posing all the questions. I think we've addressed all of them. And last but not least, I would like to thank CIEPS for a very smooth cooperation in bringing this together on the eve of what is, of course, a rather sad day but which should propel us all into thinking and planning harder how to serve the interests that we share in Europe, and as our speakers have so eloquently extolled. So thank you very much for your attention, for your participation, and looking forward to welcoming you at a future event that might already be the SEPS Ideas Lab, to the 10th edition of it, to mark the 40th anniversary of SEPS, a rather more joyous occasion, but nonetheless one which will be characterized by difficult talks nonetheless. Thank you very much for your participation, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.